The book of John. And in John, he has quite the speediness about his telling of the life of Christ. And so on this second Sunday in Epiphany, we find that Jesus is gathering up his disciples. He has just found Simon Peter and Andrew, and now they're continuing their gathering of Christ's disciples. The Holy Gospel of John. The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee, and he found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip replied, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming to him and said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed in whom is no guile." Nathanael said to Jesus, "How do you know me?" And Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under the fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered, saying, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered him, "Because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree? Do you believe? You shall see greater things than these." This ends our reading from the book of John. In our Old Testament reading this morning, we hear of Samuel being called upon. But by whom? Samuel thinks his mentor Eli is calling out to him, and he answers Eli by saying, "Here I am," and he runs to his side. But Eli did not call out to Samuel, and he tells the boy to go back to bed. And the second time, once again, Samuel hears his name called, and again believing that it really is Eli calling out to him, he says, "Here I am, you called me." And again believing that it really is Eli calling out to him, he goes slowly and speaks to Eli. And Eli once again tells him, "I did not call you. Return to your bed." The third time Samuel hears his name being called, and Samuel gets up and goes to Eli's side and says to him, "Here I am. You called me." Eli figures out that, which Samuel does not yet understand, is that God is calling Samuel. So Eli tells Samuel to go back to bed, and if you hear your name being said again, to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." And Samuel went back to his bed, and he did as Eli had told him to. Yesterday afternoon, Ron and I went to Yankton, and since I can now speak, we had a lovely conversation on the way up. But coming home, it was after 3 o'clock, and that meant that the Falcons and Eagles game was on. We found the game on our radio, and we began to listen. Not so much conversation and happening now. And as the game began, the announcer said, "The Eagles will be moving from right to left." And once the Falcons had gotten the ball, the announcer said the Falcons would be moving from left to right. So very visual, and we could see in our mind's eye what was happening. Now, I have to tell you, I don't know a lot about football and all the little intricacies of it and all those things, but there are certain words that my ears listen for, like who has the ball, as in the Falcons or the Eagles, what down it is, if they've had a sack, if there's been a fumble, and of course I listen for the word touchdown. The rest of the game to me is fra-la-la in my ears, because it means nothing to me. So while I'm driving and listening to the game, and I'm thinking about what to do with the Chinese chicken we had last night, and how am I going to use it when I get home for the tacos that we're going to have tonight? And thinking about the football game that I'm listening for and wondering about the timing of getting dinner ready before Andrew gets home from work. And I said to Ron, I hope all this stays in my head, because there's a good making of a sermon in there. And Ron said, okay. So I made it to the computer, and here it is. This is what a sermon sounds like when your pastor's thinking about football, chicken, driving, Andrew, and supper. So I could hear the football game and the announcers. But after Atlanta scored, I was pleased, and I didn't listen as well as I should have, as I did earlier in the game when there was no score. And I knew they were talking about the players who were sacking and tackling, but it didn't matter because I don't know the players' names anyway. But I was listening. Samuel was listening too and thought he knew what was going on, sorta, kind of like me. Every time Samuel heard his name, he knew it had to be Eli. And after all, who else but Eli who would be calling out to the boy? And Samuel's enthusiasm for responding to hearing his name, it slowed down the more often he heard it. At first, Samuel ran to Eli. The second time, and Samuel arose, answered, and went to Eli. And on the third time, Samuel arose, went, and then when he got to Eli, he said, I heard you call my name. What's up? And so by the third time, Eli was kind of like, oh, I get it. Too bad Samuel's not getting it. I need to share with him so he knows how to listen. So Eli says to Samuel, if you hear my name again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. Then Samuel's life gets pretty interesting after that. But what about us? How are we listening or hearing? How are we not listening or hearing? Pastor, you might be asking yourself, isn't listening and hearing the same thing? Well, that's a good question because no, they are not. The Webster's Dictionary defines listen as to pay attention in order to hear, and defines hear as to perceive by the ear. So this would imply then that one can hear conversations and take them in as noise, but one can hear a conversation as one who is listening to hear specific words, like sack, touchdown, or whatever. We hear things all day, but I imagine we aren't actually listening all day. If we know this about ourselves, that we are hearers and listeners, what happens if we aren't listening at the right time and we miss something really important? So like, what if you're listening to Jeopardy and they're at the final question and everybody's got all their money riding on the line and it's a difficult question and you don't know the answer to it, but here comes Alex Trebek and he starts with player number 1, and just as player number 1 is about to answer, doggone it, the phone rings and you don't get to hear the answer. Or the baby sneezes and you don't get to hear the answer. And you're in the kitchen, so you can't even see what Alex is telling them on their scorecard thingy. So what do? Well, those of you who are inclined might Google now the question to find the answer. Or you may get on Facebook with another avid Jeopardy fan and ask them, what was the answer? Because I missed it. Some of you might get out these weird, bizarre books called encyclopedias and dictionaries and try to find the answer there. Or a last ditch hope is that someday they'll run it as a rerun and you'll catch the answer. What if it wasn't Alex Trebek talking to us? What if it was God talking to us and we missed it? We missed listening because we stopped hearing. And we stopped hearing because everything we were hearing didn't make sense or was hypocritical to what you had been brought up in, to believe, or to think. And maybe you stopped listening because you didn't think God was talking to you anymore or at all. And that's what was happening when Samuel was hearing God's voice. 1 Samuel 3:1 said, "And the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There were no frequent vision." And that's how the prophets were seeing what God had in store, because they were offering visions in the prophets' dreams. So perhaps that's what people or you think now. No one is hearing God's voice. Instead, we hear politicians who speak horrible and awful things about countries and its people. Women from all races and walks of life calling out men for unexcusable behaviors. Our children being bullied in school and online. And it feels like everything is just spinning out of control. And in part it is. In a lot of part, it is spinning out of control. But we can't stop listening and hearing. When the din of the world becomes so loud and obtrusive, we must dig our heels in further and harder to hear and to listen for God in breaking into this world with God's very words. It can be very discouraging to listen to the news and to read in our newspapers and online how whacked our world seems, how lost it is, almost a world without love. Man versus man for the good of one and not for all. And then we catch those glimpses of humanity, reaching out to our brothers and sisters during fires and floods and mudslides and hurricanes. And we say, yes, God is still among us. But those moments come and go so quickly we can hardly hold on to God's words lived out in man before once again we see and we see the hate and we hear the words of ignorance. Do we get down on our hands and knees in prayer and listen? Listening for what God would have us to do. Listening for where God would have us to go. It could be across the street or it could be miles and miles away. But are we listening, or are we hearing and rising and going and then saying, "So now what do you want?" When you walked through the doors this morning and coming in here into this worship place of God, were you just rising and coming, and are you now only hearing? Or did you hear and in your hearing listen for what God was saying, and you ran and you said, "Here I am, Lord, your servant is listening"? I challenge us all today and in the days and weeks and months to come to begin hearing in a way that makes you want to listen to what you are hearing. Like when your favorite song comes on the radio and you hear just the first few notes and you know that that is your song and you sing along with it and you hear the voice of the singer and you hear your voice singing out so loud and proud and making it your song with all the off-key notes and wrong words in tow. But it's your song. And you love it. And it doesn't matter if you don't do it well. You've embraced it and claimed it. Today when you go to fellowship, you're heading over to the Lutheran Fellowship Hall because the Presbyterians have a meeting afterwards. And there's a whole lot of snickerdoodles over there, but if you would save some for Adam, he would really appreciate it. So don't eat all this snickerdoodles. So anyhow, back to what we're doing here. So say we're over in the fellowship hall and you're standing in line waiting for your coffee and things this morning. And what if you hear someone's conversation, a few people ahead of you, and they're talking about going to the state fair to hear Sugarland play? Will you drop by once they get seated and engage in the conversation and say, boy, I'd like to go? Or are you going to hear that conversation, strain from another table to hear what they're talking about because you decided, I can't join in that conversation for whatever reason, but I really want to go, but I'm just sitting here and wondering, should I go ask them if I can go? Should I go ask them when it is? Should I? When we hear a conversation that feeds us, whether it's a song or a conversation about going to the state fair to hear Sugarland, we need to move forward. We need to run quickly and say, here's your servant, Lord, to let me serve you in the way that you have called me to do. We have to practice hearing to listen. So we start by hearing, and then in hearing, listening. Listening for key words in a conversation or key notes in a song. And we practice and we practice. And perhaps before long, we aren't practicing, but doing the hearing that leads to listening. And in the listening, we can hear God's voice. A voice that may sound like a child. A voice that may be unfamiliar, but sounds good to your soul. A voice that may be coming out of your own mouth as people hear and listen to you, to hear God in your words. People will begin to hear God's words from you when we hear and when we listen. God is here. God is speaking. Are you listening?